to week 10 of Crim 103. We're on part 2 lecture of the topic of psychopathy. And so for this week, we're going to be focusing on what the experience of interviewing someone with features of psychopathy actually is like. So I'll talk about my assessment experiences in interviewing youth, both the interview skills that I've developed and then the actual experience of being in the interview, what individuals have said, and then most importantly, I'll provide specific examples of what different symptoms or different features of psychopathy actually look like. So how do we assess for somebody who is uncaring versus somebody who is uncommitted? What is the difference between these two symptoms of the attachment domain of the CAP? So I'm going to be focusing on each of the 6 domains of the CAP. I'll talk a bit about all 33 symptoms located within those 6 domains, and we'll give some case study examples of what kids with features of psychopathy actually look like. And I'll begin with some details about the interview process, because I think this is so important for criminology students as well as psychology students to really understand. The reason being is if you're going to be a police officer, probation officer, if you're going to be a lawyer, whether it's Crown Counsel or defense, if you want to be a clinician, a therapist. One of the things that I did when I was an undergraduate student was work for Canada Border Service Agency, and that position was what really helped me develop interview skills, because you have to learn how to frame questions and how to listen to people in order to get the information that you're looking for. So whether you're focusing on being a police officer and you're interrogating a suspect, whether you're Crown Counsel and you are examining a witness, or you're defense counsel and you're cross-examining a witness, developing these interview skills can be very important to be effective at your job. So we'll talk a little bit about the actual interview process. And of course, this is going to be the interview process as it applies to assessing for features of psychopathy. So some things might not really apply, but there are some general broader things like developing rapport that I think that will be helpful for everybody, not just people assessing for psychopathy. When it comes to assessing for psychopathy, of course, what really is important is having a strong understanding of what is and what is not a symptom. You have to be able to understand what actually represents an example of manipulation and how to probe further for questions about the extent to which somebody is manipulative. How manipulative are they compared to others? Being a good interviewer also requires the ability to distinguish not just whether a symptom is present or absent, but again, how strong the symptom is and whether it results in functional impairment. So that functional impairment is very important. It speaks to whether the person's level of callousness is actually causing problems in their day-to-day life. So let's say, for example, there's an individual who appears to be very callous because they do not care about their family whatsoever. And so on the surface, it might appear like they're very callous. They don't care what happens to their father, they don't care what happens to their mother. But what we really need to understand, especially when we're dealing with populations of persons involved in crime, very often they come from very tumultuous family backgrounds. Backgrounds characterized by things like experiences of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental abuse, not meeting the needs of the child. All of these different things can really take a toll on the individual and may lead to them not really caring too much about their family because they don't even really see them as family. They're not acting like family. They're not caring for this individual. So why should they even really care about them? So that's why we need strong interview skills to recognize, okay, here's why they don't care about their family. So let's ask them, like, well, do you have any people that you're really close to that are maybe like surrogates? Like, they're not your biological family, but they're people who you really count on. You're there for them, they're there for you. And maybe they'll open up and talk about friends or other people that they've met along their life that have really had a strong impact on them and who they care for. And so then we can begin to see, okay, there's no real functional impairment of callousness here. This individual wants to be like detached from their family, but it's because their family can bring them harm. So it's actually kind of a protective mechanism in this particular case. Before we get to this, you need to have strong interview skills to be able to kind of elicit this information, to have active listening skills to understand, okay, what are they telling me about their family that's really standing out as whether or not this is true callousness or whether it's just shutting off from family members as a means of like self-protection or self-preservation. An assessment is only as good as the information that you're able to gather, which makes the interview process really, really critical. There are about 5 different skills that I'll talk about in the interview and before the interview that you can really work on. One is rapport, sort of like how we get along with the person that we're interviewing. And again, this can kind of vary depending on the context that you're in. If you're a Crown Counsel examining a witness, maybe it's not so important to have rapport, but if you're a clinician, a therapist, if you're doing treatment, rapport is essential. During the interview, you might experience individuals lying to you, and in fact, I would say that everybody lies during the interview. Sometimes these lies are just very small, and sometimes they're not really egregious lies, they're just more like withholding information. And I think that's only natural especially if you haven't developed a long history of rapport with an individual. Can't necessarily just expect them to automatically divulge all the personal details of their life. So you have to make a decision about when to, if you think that somebody is being dishonest, sometimes you just let them be dishonest. Let them lie about this one thing. Or do you need to challenge them a little bit? And how do you do this challenge without damaging rapport? Remember last week I showed you that reporter who's just like, "Who are you? Why are you a bad person?" And that's not going to really help you in terms of getting people to open up to you. You need to figure out how to respond to dishonesty without damaging rapport. It's also important, again, my experiences with youth, of being sensitive to developmental stages. So how you conduct the interview can depend on whether you're interviewing a toddler or a teenager or an adult. I don't believe in things like how it's really important to pay attention to body language, because if somebody's eyes move up and to the left, they're telling the truth, or up and to the right, they're lying, or vice versa. I don't necessarily believe all that, especially because it sort of can get us into trouble when we make sort of assumptions that all of these forms of body language are universal across culture. In some cultures, in indigenous cultures, for example, it's not necessarily a sign of respect to look someone in the eye. In other cultures, individuals might laugh during what might appear to be an inappropriate time, but they might be laughing because they feel embarrassed, or they're laughing because they feel nervous, or laughing because they feel ashamed. In some cultures, we might look at this and say oh, they're not taking this seriously, they think that this is a joke. When in reality, this laughter might be more nervousness or shame, and we need to be able to be attuned to that. So the ways that I think we need to figure out how somebody is reacting or what somebody is saying and how their body language looks is by using good follow-up questions. Making sure that if we see something, don't just assume that it's definitely the case. Follow up with that. Ask questions, get answers, make sure you're going to be sure before moving forward. Especially when we're dealing with individuals with features of psychopathy, or maybe if you're interviewing a hostile witness or interrogating somebody who is hostile towards the police, you need to figure out how to manage the integrity of the interview. And what this means is you need to be good at dealing with things like antagonism from other people. When other people are trying to criticize you or being derogatory towards you, when do you ignore it? When do you respond and stand up for yourself? So we'll talk a little bit about all of these skills throughout the rest of this lecture. Alright, so let's start first with rapport, which is especially critical in a research context. Always remember that the participant is giving you their time. You should be grateful for that. If you don't appreciate the participant, you probably shouldn't be in the job that you're in. It's important to let them know that you appreciate their time. If you want people to share their thoughts and their feelings, you need to gain their trust. And part of gaining trust shows that you're there for the right reasons. You're there to listen to their story. You're not here to judge them. You're not going to be using this information against them or throwing things back in their face. If you hear that they've done something wrong, you're not going to critique them for it. So it's really important to communicate to that individual even before the interview so that they can feel comfortable. They might still not trust you. Just because you've said it doesn't mean they're automatically going to trust you. But at least it sends a signal to them. You're aware that this is something that they would obviously care about, and you're going to do your best to live up to that responsibility or that expectation. One of the ways that you can really get to know somebody, especially in a forensic context or a criminal justice system context, is usually they have a file. So you can read information before the interview to kind of get a sense of the person's life. If they've had a parent that's died, like if their mom died when they were 5 years old from drug use. When you're going to begin to ask them questions about their family, you can mention, like, I know that you've had a really tough experience in the past because your file indicated that your mother has passed away, but I'd like to talk about your experience with her early in your life, or I'd like to talk to you about the rest of your family members. I'm really sorry to hear that your mother has passed. Just ways that you can begin to, like, you're not just going to jump in and say, like, hey, tell me about your mother. Has she come to visit you while you've been in custody? And then they say, no, my mom's dead. And then you have to kind of work through this maybe more awkward scenario, especially if you weren't very empathetic when you initially asked the question, because it can sound like a very innocuous question. Hey, has your mom come to visit? Lots of people have their mom come to visit. Also, what's really, I think, the most important thing is to find your style. What I mean by this is figure out, like, the best parts of your personality and work with those. Don't try to be disingenuous. So for example, when I was doing the assessments, there were some people who were much more outgoing than I was. They're really just naturally outgoing people, and they'd be very excited for the interview, and they'd talk kind of like fast and loud and like with a lot of energy. That wasn't really my style. I'm not saying that theirs is better than my style or vice versa. What I'm saying is that it would be disingenuous of me to walk into that interview room and pretend to be that person. I would be myself. I would just be very straightforward with them. I would be patient before trying to become very friendly with them. Like, I wouldn't try to be their best friend right away, because especially for people in the justice system, they've experienced a lot of people that have let them down in the past or lied to them. So I try to be very patient. I'll find the right time to make a joke. You take what is given to you. So you wait for that right moment to make a joke, or to try and find some common ground, or to up your level of enthusiasm instead of starting by being really enthusiastic right away. Active listening is a skill that you need to have to get information, but it's also a skill that you need to have to build rapport. So usually what happens with interviews like the CAP and other interviews for assessing psychopathy or other forms of mental disorders, you do what's called a semi-structured interview. So you have an instrument that provides you with a list of questions aimed towards, say, the symptoms of psychopathy that you're trying to assess. But you're expected to come up with your own questions as part of natural conversation. So as part of this natural conversation, it's very possible that you will talk about their relationship with their mother. But maybe 10 minutes later, there's a specific interview question that says, tell me about your relationship with your mother. If you haven't been listening all along, you might just re-ask that question, and they're going to be like, what the hell, dude? Like, I just talked to you for 5 minutes about how I had this really negative relationship with my mom, and now you're asking this question again? Are you not even listening to what I'm saying? That's a really good way to damage rapport. Paying attention to what they're saying is far more important than thinking about the next question. Let things evolve naturally, just like you would with a friend. You wouldn't, while they're talking about something that they're going through, you wouldn't just be thinking, like, what is the next question that I should ask them? Like, I wonder what they're doing on the weekend. You're gonna pay attention to what they're saying in the moment and respond appropriately. The other thing about the interviews are that they could tend to focus on negative topics. So you need to find a way to end the interview in the right way. Sometimes I would just make up questions towards the end just to end things on a lighter note. One of the reasons why it's really important to do so in a custody context is you can actually place your participant at risk of victimization by other people. If, for example, you're asking them about a relationship that's fallen apart, or the current offense that they might get a really long sentence for, and so they might feel really depressed or sad, they might be crying. If you send them back to the unit, especially on male unit with 6, 7, 8 other individuals involved in serious offenses, they might antagonize that individual. They might tease them for crying or for looking upset. And so you need to protect them so that they will also remember, okay, like, this interview is safe. I can do this interview and then I can leave and things are going to be okay. You can talk about, like, what they're going to be doing for dinner, like in custody, sometimes they're cooking their own meals, what programs they have in the evening, what movie they're going to watch, if there's hockey, baseball, whatever. Find something to connect with that's going to end things on a positive note. Another good way to build rapport is to understand part of the culture of the custody center is like, you don't name names, you don't be a rat. And in research, we get to have a very special level of confidentiality. When I would do the interviews, basically I would say to them, I have to protect confidentiality over everything else, basically. And so I communicate that to the individual before I do the interview, because I also understand that in a criminal justice system context, so in custody, keeping your word is so important. If you robbed a bank and you've got 10 grand sitting under your mattress at home, you tell me that information and I can't do anything with it. So I've had kids tell me they committed a homicide and not got caught for it. That has to stay with me. So if you communicate how important confidentiality is to you, that's sort of a shared principle. Researchers care so much about confidentiality. Some participants might be wary of that, like, why would I trust this person to keep my secret? So what I explain to them is that because I'm a researcher, I have not just an ethical obligation to keep things confidential, I have a legal obligation to keep things confidential. That I could be sued if I were to take information that was said during the interview and give it to other people. So that's a good way for the participant to feel like they are protected and that they'll be more comfortable opening up during the interview. Like I mentioned, I don't really buy too much into the idea that we can detect dishonesty through behavioral cues, like whether their eyes move up or down.
Reading your eyes. The eyes can't lie. Didn't you know what I was doing? A quick lesson in lying. See, this is what us real cops do. We study liars. Example, if I ask you a question about something visual, like your favorite color, and your eyes go up and to the left, well, neurophysiology tells us that your eyes go in that direction because you're accessing the visual cortex. Therefore, you're telling the truth. If your eyes go up and right, then you're accessing the creative centers of the brain, and we know you're full of shit. Now, let's try this again. What's your favorite television show?
I'm not gonna play your stupid game, okay, Roman?
Oh, why, Nebom? You afraid we'll catch you on a lie? When did you find out Nate was investigating the fund?
After I spoke with you.
Whoa, that is a lie if I've ever...
Never even blinked my eyes, you scum.
You didn't blink, Nebom. It's your body language. It says you're lying.
He's nervous, Danny. What do you expect from him?
Shut up, Frost. You know how this works. It's not just your eyes, Nebom. It's everything. If you cough, sneeze, cross your legs, scratch your ass, they're all telltale signs. You can't cheat. You can stare at me with those dead-ass eyes of yours all you want. You can't beat the system.
When it comes to detecting dishonesty, I've read like some of the work of Albert Breege, who's really well known in this literature area. And basically, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that you can use like behavioral cues or body movements to like definitely pinpoint dishonesty. In my viewpoint, the best way to deal with and detect dishonesty is to prepare and be attentive. Preparing means going to that file, making sure you understand the background to the person you're about to interview so that you can notice discrepancies between what their file says and what they're saying. The other key is, again, just like with developing rapport, active listening skills, so that you can recall, okay, in this one time point, you said that you were going to go to drug and alcohol treatment when you were released from custody. But later in the interview, you also mentioned that you were going to look forward to meeting up with your girlfriend when you were released and hanging out by the lake. And then when I asked you what you would like to do with your girlfriend, the individual would have said, like, and this is an actual case, talk to me about how he'd like to use crack cocaine with his girlfriend. Things begin to not add up. They said they were going to go to treatment, but they're also saying that they are going to hang out with their girlfriend instead, and they don't seem to be that interested in drug and alcohol counseling because they might sort of want to be going and continuing to use crack with this person because that's mostly what they did together. And one of the important things about dishonesty during the interview is to not be too, like, don't take it personally when people are dishonest with you, because at some points they might actually be dishonest because they care about what you think of them. This individual might be telling me that they're going to go to treatment because we've maybe just met and they want to leave a good impression. One of the things that I would say that's very true of all interview experiences is that everybody lies. Lying doesn't have to just be like really egregious things though. It could also be like withholding of information, not giving somebody the full story. So sometimes it's not even necessary to actually go and like challenge somebody if they've been deceitful, because it can also give you a sense of who they want to be. So it can help give a sense of what their identity is, how they want other people to see them. It can also help you give a sense of just how deceitful are they willing to be. When assessing for symptoms of psychopathy, sometimes this honesty does not even matter and there's no need to like challenge the participant, because that can reduce the rapport. But when you do decide, okay, I do need to challenge this person, challenges can vary in intensity. You don't have to be like that interviewer in the Richard Ramirez case when you're like, you lied, why are you a bad person? You can be kind of more subtle about it. So one of the terms that I've used for this subtlety is the Columbo approach. Now, I came up with this term, but I've seen other people use it as well, so I don't know if I was the first person to come up with it. But the Columbo approach goes back to like a detective from maybe it was like 1960s, 70s TV, where instead of, when he was looking at a criminal suspect and interviewing them, instead of being like, where were you on the night of December 10th, and being like really aggressive, taking the light and shining it in their face and everything like that, you kind of feign confusion. So he'd be like, well, you said on Saturday that you were with your aunt, but when I talked to your aunt, she said she was at the bingo hall, and how could you be with your aunt if she wasn't where you said that you were? Can you just help me make sense of all of this? And you kind of let them fill in the pieces of the puzzle for you. So you get them to help you make sense of all of this. And I think this works even better in a research context as opposed to a police context where it's more confrontational. In a research context, they might just be like, okay, this person is just trying to get information and I'll help them with this. Like if the Columbo approach doesn't work and you need to do a more high intensity challenge, I recommend waiting until the end of the interview. The reason why is like it can diminish rapport, could even result in the person wanting to end the interview. So for example, for one individual, he had committed an aggravated assault against his grandmother. He actually slashed his grandmother's throat with a knife. Obviously she lived, but very horrific offense. And it caused a lot of strain between him and his grandma, obviously, but also him and the rest of his family. His grandma was his father's mom, and so there was a lot of strain in the relationship between this youth and his father. And we needed to get at these family relationships, and the youth would not acknowledge his involvement in the offense and would basically just say, no, like, my family and I get along, my family and I get along. But we knew from his file that like his family hadn't come to see them. Staff had mentioned that there was this conflict between him and his family. So we tried the Columbo approach, we tried different things, and then finally we waited till we got through all the rest of our questions. And at the end of the interview, we said, okay, so we do have access to your file, as you know, and we know that there is this conflict between you and your family, and you said that everything is fine. Can you maybe help us understand what's going on here? And this is why it's really important to pay attention to what the body language. Like I'm not saying that body language is helpful for dishonesty, but it can be helpful for placing things in context. And he became bright red, not with embarrassment, but like clenched fist. He was angry. He didn't like the fact that we knew this information, because committing an offense against a grandmother could be very stigmatizing in custody, and he could get, if other people knew about this, they might treat him poorly. What he told us was basically, actually, I'm really angry at my family. I hate them. They're dead to me because they ratted me out. So this was helpful for us because we got at the fact that, okay, he doesn't actually feel that bad for his offense. He's mad at his family. He's mad that he got caught. And this is sort of the emotion that he's feeling. This individual had a real strong propensity for violence. He was released, and instead of going to treatment, he actually went with his girlfriend to a new part of town and committed a homicide offense with his girlfriend. He was then incarcerated, moved to a different facility, and he actually tried to commit an attempted homicide in the custody center as well. So he's had a long history of really violent behavior. If you're interviewing youth or toddlers or even persons with mental disabilities, you have to pay attention to their developmental status. How you phrase questions, how you frame questions, and the context that you focus on all matter. Interviewing youth is definitely different from adults. They have poor understanding of language, less likely to be able to pay attention, they're more active, they don't have that ability to carry out long conversations, so often you have to like chunk the interview up into 20 minutes. Sometimes I would like play ping pong with kids because they would be bored, and it'd be a way to like, okay, do the interview for 20 minutes and then play ping pong, and then we'll get back to the interview, instead of like trying to go too long and then they'll just quit and maybe they won't want to do the interview again. One of the things that's also important about adolescents, and this is especially important for police officers, how you frame questions can really dictate answers. Adolescents are more likely to change their answer in response to negative feedback. So if they say something and you provide a judgmental response, they might recant and say, oh no, I actually didn't do that. Phrasing of questions matters as well. Like there's a language barrier, so adolescents tend to have a lower level of functioning, especially when you're dealing with adolescents in a custody center that tend to have a variety of other risk factors. We would ask questions like, do you have trouble working out when other people are angry with you? And so the question is getting at, when other people are angry at you, are you aware of this? So it's trying to get at the sense of like, can you figure out other people's emotions? But they heard the term working out and took it literally as like going to the gym. Like, are you able to go to the gym when people are angry at you? And so they'll look at you like really weirdly, like, what are you talking about, man? Like, why is this even a question? So it can actually, these stupid questions can actually damage rapport, because they'll look at you like, this is a dumb question. And it happens a lot. Like, you have to really figure out how to phrase these questions, especially to these kids, because they have very low frustration tolerance. Adolescents are also going through a period of real identity development. So if you ask them like philosophical questions or conceptual questions about like how they see themselves, like what's your personality like, what type of a person are you, they can have a really difficult time giving you a response. But a trick that I learned is you ask them about somebody that you think that they're similar to. So you say, hey, like, do you have a best friend? What are some of the things that you share in common with your best friend? Tell me about your best friend. What are they like? Do you think that you're also this way? So giving them something concrete to compare to can be really helpful there. Talked about this last week, but we also have to pay attention to heterotypic continuity. Often these interviews are designed for adults, and they'll ask about work, and they'll ask about a spouse, children, and so on. So we should focus instead of work on school, instead of like spouse on friends. Instead of like work, we could also focus on parents. Asking about politics is important for assessing psychopathy, because it can get at things like inflexibility and intolerant attitudes towards other people. But especially in this youth custody context, like not a lot of the kids are reading the Vancouver Sun on a Sunday morning or anything like that. Politics isn't really something that they're going to follow. So instead we'd focus on like cliques and more like superficial things. So they would hate, like there's stigmatization around people that use crystal meth. So we would ask them about crystal meth users, because that's viewed as a dirty drug in a youth custody context. We would ask them about slang terms in custody, like greasy kids, kids that don't have proper hygiene. They don't like kids that follow rules. So these are different ways of getting towards intolerant and flexible attitudes. For adults, they tend to focus on positive impression management, trying to paint themselves in a pro-social light. Kids, on the other hand, might engage in negative impression management, where they might even exaggerate their involvement in criminal behavior. Like, I'll have like little snot-nosed kids telling me that they run Surrey and stuff like that, or they're a real high-ranking gang member, and it's like, no, we know that you're not. But again, you don't necessarily have to challenge them on that, because it can damage rapport. It gives you a sense of, okay, here's how they want to be seen. Aside from rapport, maybe the most important part of the interview process is being able to ask good follow-up questions, because each question on its own is not really enough to get at the depth of the symptoms of psychopathy. So you need to have these good follow-up questions. Good follow-up questions come from active listening. You can't really like write down in advance good follow-up questions, because you don't know when they're going to be needed. The follow-up question is all about listening to the answer to the first question. So that really requires good active listening. Many youth in custody settings have extremely dysfunctional families, as I mentioned, and may not care about family members. So follow-up questions here help clarify why the lack of a relationship with the family member exists, why they do not actually care about how their family is doing. Follow-up questions are also very useful to probe superficial relationships or superficial expressions of remorse. So we'll give you some more concrete examples later on. But what we can often see is that kids will say oh yeah, I really care about my girlfriend, but they might not really care about their girlfriend. They care about the relationship and what it gives them. They don't have much concern for the well-being of the actual person. That person is really kind of disposable. They would find a new person if that person was going to better suit them. It can also be very important to figure out how we assess for features of happiness. So one of the symptoms on the CAP is a lack of pleasure. Individuals that are in custody often talk about, oh yeah, lots of things give me pleasure. If you just end there, you'd think, okay, lacks pleasure, they're going to score very low. But if you follow up, types of things that give them pleasure are really negative. And that's not what pleasure is supposed to be. Pleasure is what we call infectious. If I'm laughing, that's giving me pleasure. Is my laughter infectious? Are other people going to laugh when I'm laughing? If not, that's not really a good example of the pro-social types of pleasure that we're looking for. So if you read literature on interview skills, they'll provide you examples of follow-up questions can you tell me more about that? Or can you talk about blank? You would never use this type of language with family and friends, but you see reporters, especially sports reporters, do this all the time. If they're interviewing Elias Pettersson after a Canuck game and they're like, hey, can you talk to me about how you generated that first goal?
Chris, can you talk about your success against the Yankees this year?
No.
It's not really a question. It's you don't really know what to ask them. So you're can you just talk about this? You wouldn't really say that to a friend. If you go grab a coffee and you're hey, can you talk about what went down when you and our other friend got into a fight on the weekend? It's kind of a weird way to phrase things. I think that you shouldn't have these canned, generic follow-up questions. You can, through experience, develop ways in which you follow up. So, for example, one of the things that I learned about asking about family members, when they would say things no, I don't really spend much time with my family. Instead of saying something can you tell me more about that? One of the things that I would say would be, was that always the case? So this way we can begin to figure out, did something happen with their family to change what their relationship was like? If something really big has happened in a person's life, you want to build up to it. And I think one of the ways that you can do that is with have things changed. So that helps us get towards, okay, if they did change, what were things like before? And was there anything that happened to make things different? One of the key things about features of psychopathy is that for them to be really strong, they need to be present across multiple contexts. To be really strong in features of detachment, uncaring, uncommitted, can't just be with respect to family. It has to be with respect to all people, even friends. The people that they're supposed to be closest with are people that they don't show much care for. And so you have to be able to ask not just about family, but about friends, about teachers, custody center staff, if they've been in foster care, group home workers, everything like that. So when youth are connected to others, you can begin to figure out, why do these connections exist? Is it because they care about other people, or do they use their relationships as ways to engage in harmful interactions with others? Some like to actually just be very antagonistic and manipulate others. So you need to figure out, how come you're close to this person? Do you actually like this person, or do you like what they bring you? Is it fun to manipulate them? Part of the challenge of assessing for psychopathy is sometimes you come across somebody with really strong features of psychopathy, And then the interview can be very difficult because they can do things like antagonize you. They will have a lack of self-control, so they'll be moving all throughout the room. They'll be fidgeting. They'll be having poor levels of concentration. They're all over the place. You have to sort of develop strategies for dealing with some of these things. For example, there's one youth, we'll call him Albert, who's just like totally unable to sit still, and he's always fidgeting with his hands, rocking a table back and forth. And then so I suggested like, hey, why don't we try and fix the table? And he's like, no, you do it. And so we can begin to see like, okay, he's got this fidgety, but he's also kind of like controlling and using other people for his advantage. There's something that he has a problem. He's not even willing to fix it. He just wants somebody else to fix it. So those are some like the behavioral nonverbal expressions of impulsivity. Another thing that you can begin to see with individuals with strong features of psychopathy is what might look like they're fidgety, but it's actually a sign of being controlling. So it's one of those dominant symptoms. So if you go into the interview room and you have like your papers and pencils on the desk, while you're asking questions, the individual might seem distracted because they begin to do this. They begin to take your things or their things, and they're going to organize them just so. So everything will begin to be altered the way that they want. And so you might think, okay, like maybe they're OCD or something like that. But really what it is that they're trying so hard to take back some of the control that they've lost by being the interviewee and not the interviewer, that they try to control physical objects in the room. One of the other things that they can want to do is like physically take over the interview and say like, you're just give me the interview, I'll answer the questions on my own. Or they'll try to take the pen from you, very rigidly watch what you're writing down to make sure that you're capturing their perspective word for word. Another difficult part of the interviewer experience is antagonism, where the kid will actually try and like say mean things to you. They'll ask things like, oh, I bet you that I make more money selling drugs than you do interviewing me, things like this. And what's really key is like, never be defensive. And the other thing is, don't necessarily try to change the subject. They'll catch on that, okay, like I hit a nerve and they want to change the subject, so I'm going to go back to that subject. And that's again part of like controlling. If they said like, oh, I bet that I make more money than you dealing drugs than you do interviewing me, and I would silently cry internally because they're probably right. But when I'd say things like, oh, that's interesting, like how long have you been dealing drugs? What types of drugs do you deal? Do you like it? You can be a little bit more cagey about it and keep the topic of the discussion, but refocus it on the youth. And that's what's really key, because they can sometimes ask intrusive personal questions as well. And one of the keys, and you can play to their egocentricity, is basically saying things like, well, this interview is all about you. I'm not that interesting. Let's get to know you. That's who should be on the focus today. So that's again another way to not be defensive, not deflect, but really play to the individual's own desires and what they want. Another symptom of psychopathy that sometimes like you don't even need to ask questions about is garrulousness. Garrulousness is basically like using technical jargon, responding in really roundabout ways, long-winded answers, especially in response to simple questions. And this is often actually part of their attempt again to like take control over others. This garrulousness can cause confusion in others. It's a way of the individual being sort of the dictator of conversation, and you can really see back in week 1 when we watched the Kemper videos, he would just talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. And that's sort of a sign of his real garrulousness.
It feels like
I would say that this is probably my favorite next like 50 minutes of the entire semester, all talking about my actual experiences interviewing kids and assessing for psychopathy. I'll be talking about my experiences specifically using the CAP, even though I used a PCLYV also. I think talking about the CAP provides us with a little bit more depth of perspective of what it's like to assess for psychopathy. So to remind everybody, basically there are 6 domains of the CAP. We have attachment, behavior, cognitive, dominance, emotion, and self. Across these 6 domains are 33 symptoms that we need to actually assess. And these symptoms are rated in different ways. So we'll rate the overall symptom on 0 to 6, the symptom strength, and its functional impairment are also rated. And then there are like adjectival descriptors that we can look as being present or not present, and then other sort of like synonym traits that we have to rate as well. So it's a really long, complex process. And I want to kind of give you the sense of like how arduous it is. Like, it is grueling to assess for psychopathy using the CAP. It takes me sometimes like 20 hours to do from like the interview through to the rating, whereas sometimes with the PCLYV, I can do the interview and the rating in like 3 or 4 hours. So that's one of the barriers to using the CAP, is that it's much more expensive because it takes much longer to actually do. But hopefully this will give you a sense of what the experience is actually like. The way that I'm going to teach students about the CAP is by using quotes from kids that I've interviewed. So these word-for-word quotes include offensive language. And I think it's important that I include it because it's also educational. It gives you a sense of what it's like to be in that room. I ask you in tutorial discussions to be professional, and generally speaking, it's not professional to swear. But these types of words give us a sense of who these individuals are and what it's like to be interviewing that individual. It's not like they're just saying like, oh, I love to do fucking robberies. Things that I'm including in here are them, the interviewee, making really derogatory statements about different things or people, and especially women. And I think it's important to shed light on this so people understand what the experience might be like for them if they ever do this as part of their own sort of work. So first up is the attachment domain that includes 4 symptoms. And the attachment domain is focusing on the degree to which an individual has emotional bonds to others. So it's kind of like part of that affective facet of the PCL. Emotional bonds refer to the degree of like affiliation, so like connectivity, intimacy, and acceptance by others. And it's represented by both, like as I mentioned, affective traits, but also some interpersonal ones as well. The attachment domain refers only to attachment to humans. Positive attachment to animals are not part of the assessment. There are 4 symptoms to the attachment domain. The first is detached, which describes individuals that are remote. So what that means is they're difficult to reach. So there's like a big difference between being detached and being uncommitted. Detached means that other people can't reach this person. Uncommitted means this person is not attached to other people. Detached, think of it like a remote island. You can't actually reach that person. Examples or manifestations of detachment mean individuals will not really discuss family or friends. They don't really care about whether family and friends are visiting them. They have a preference for being alone, not really having to use up their time being around other people. Individuals that are uncommitted, again, they're unbound to other people. They will switch from relationship to relationship quite quickly. They actively do bad things to other people. They will screw over people, they will cheat on people, they will lie to people, and not really care about changing these relationships. And that differs a lot from somebody who is uncaring. Uncommitted is actively doing bad things to other people. Uncaring is failing to help people who really look like they need it. So if somebody is like, they're inconsiderate, sort of like thoughtless, neglecting other people who might be in need. So if somebody is like crying, you fail to do the thing that would be expected of you, which is to go and like comfort them, for example. And the last one, unempathic, which I think is pretty straightforward, asking them to like reflect on how their behavior has impacted others. They might say things like, I don't know them, like I'm not them, how do I know what they're thinking? These can be sort of that evidence of a lack of empathy. I'll provide you with a series of different cases, but 2 that I think you'll see that recur over and over are Justin and Owen, 2 of the individuals that, in my experience, had the strongest features of psychopathy of any persons that I've ever interviewed. These are individuals that like I'll never forget the interview experience with them because it was like quite haunting. So Justin, when he was talking about his father, mother, and friends, he kind of said the following: I am detached enough from my father to not care about his absence. It's hard to listen to my mom. I think it's a respect thing. And this was when he was discussing an assault against his mother. He said, most of my friends are from school. They are temporary and can be replaced. I don't feel loyalty to anyone. Very early in life, I decided that everyone was an idiot. At around 13, I isolated myself from everyone. So you can see a lot of different symptoms from the attachment domain here. So for example, when he's talking about his father and doesn't care about his absence, that's a great example of detachment. In fact, he uses the word detach right in the quote there. His mom, he's not very committed to her. He talks about assaulting her, not really listening to her. Especially his friends he's not committed to. He talks about how they can be replaced. Talks about how he really doesn't care about anybody. He thinks they're all idiots. And again, towards that example of detachment, he said that around age 13, I isolated myself from everyone. What's key about Justin is that his attachment and lack of commitment to others are not confined to a specific individual. Justin demonstrates a lack of commitment to others, and what's key is that it's not limited to one particular individual or one particular time period. He's not committed to friends, family, kids at school, teachers. His attitudes towards his family have been present from a very young age, and again, this is key because features of psychopathy, they need to be strong and they need to be persistent. Here's a quote from another youth, Owen, that's helping sort of get at his level of or lack of caring towards other people. He doesn't really want to do things with other people. So he says that he doesn't really like to have a lot of friends because it's too hard to please everybody. And again, uncaring, he doesn't want to do things that are going to make other people feel good. I'm only friends with these people who don't expect me to do much for them. My girlfriend never really expects me to take her anywhere, and I don't really want to take her anywhere. I had the decency to go on a break with my girlfriend before hooking up with another girl. I just told her I wanted to go on a break. She was upset, but at the same time I was going to jail. It was a bit selfish, and then he laughed about that. For Owen, he knew that he committed a very serious offense and expected to get caught for it. So he wanted to break up with his girlfriend or go on a break with his girlfriend so that he felt that he could then be like, it was ethically okay for him to go and be with this other person. He didn't really care about his girlfriend. He just thought that this was the thing to do. Owen's lack of empathy was really evident when talking about the victim of the offense, and he basically just referred to as unremarkable and kind of this callous sort of attitude that he had towards the victim. Owen was also fairly negative towards his sister, and this also helps illustrate his lack of attachment, but also why follow-up questions are really important, because he said that he liked to do things to help his sister because of their family bond. But then when asked further about like examples of what he would do for her, he couldn't really come up with any. Instead, he just said like, I've probably beat her up more than anybody, and laughed about it. And this is pretty severe because this individual, Owen, was about 6'4", 200 some odd pounds. So quite a big guy, obviously able to really bring harm to other people. Turning to the behavioral domain, this domain is concerned with the ability to regulate behavior or goal-directed activity. Individuals who score high on this domain are unable to create like adaptive strategies to coping with life. So they don't actually have like organizational skills and things like that. They don't deal with life in a systematic and consistent manner. So they can't be counted on to do the right. Key aspect of this domain is the failure to manage impulses, especially aggressive impulses. Here's a list of the 6 symptoms associated with the behavioral domain, beginning with a lack of perseverance. These are individuals who are idle and undisciplined. They don't really work hard, so they lack a work ethic. They can't do the things that are sort of expected of them. They don't really want to attend school or work. They have shown no ability to follow a routine or a schedule. There's also a big difference here between individuals that are unreliable and individuals that are disruptive. People who are unreliable are people who you can't really count on to be on time or even to show up whatsoever. Whereas individuals that are disruptive are physically there, but they are causing some sort of a disturbance. Their behavior is problematic, kind of like thinking about conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. They're going to interrupt school teachers, they're not going to follow rules, they cause problems for others, and so on. Then there's also a big difference between being reckless and restless. Individuals that are reckless are sensation seeking, so they will do risk-taking things. Whereas individuals with restlessness are like fidgety, energetic, they can't really sit still, and this again it causes functional impairment, like their ability to do work, to get homework done, and so on. Lastly is aggression, and aggression doesn't have to refer just to criminal behavior. These can be describing individuals that are threatening, will engage in bullying, or who are involved in violent behavior. And it can be both covert or overt forms of aggression. So like social aggression can also be an example here. Again, the key is to move away from the PCL family and not be so focused on criminal behavior. Whenever we would do interviews, youth would be compensated with juice and chips. So they would get a little like Five Alive juice box or something like that, Minute Maid juice box. They loved them. One individual was so fidgety that during the interview he was drinking his juice box and playing with it. It was one of those Five Alive blue and like bright orange boxes. By the end of the interview, the box was white. All you could see was the cardboard. And this was because he was so fidgety that he had played with the juice box so much that all of the ink had rubbed off on his hands. This was Albert. Albert basically acknowledged that he's not very motivated and then he tends to slack off. So he's like, in my own time, I like to do stupid shit, go around and steal things. Instead of going to school, I would just stay home and wander the streets. I once wrote a complaint form in custody but was too lazy to hand it in. So that's a very good example of lacking perseverance. I clean in here only because it is mandatory. Even by grade 4, a teacher had described Albert as being relatively lazy. His decision to only clean in custody was basically again showing he kind of doesn't really have much organization. He's only doing things that are required of him because he's getting points or he's getting rewarded for it. When he's out in the community, he does not really engage in any of this type of behavior. He's not consistent, he's not reliable. Here's what I think is a great example of like Justin's lacking goals, which can be related to things like a lack of perseverance. Justin wanted to be either a doctor or, in his words, the editor of a biological sciences journal, which sounds great. So he's got these very good goals and they're pro-social goals. But how is Justin actually going to accomplish this? In fact, Justin had dropped out of school by about grade 8, and as you'll see later on, he has a really negative attitude towards school. So here it's like he just likes the sound of being able to tell people that he's going to be a doctor or he's going to be an editor of a biological sciences journal. These are things that help prop him up, but he has no plan for how he's actually going to accomplish them. Switching back to Albert, when Albert was a kid, his father couldn't find a babysitter and had to bring Albert to work. Albert was left alone for a few minutes and ended up vandalizing the entire workplace, including defecating in an office. By Albert's own admission, he was not dependable and basically said that I'd be willing to screw over friends, everybody has their price. I'd say that the most difficult domain to assess is the cognitive domain because it deals especially with thought processes. So it's focusing on mental actions and the processes that individuals go through in thinking about behavior or responding to behavior. So it's concerned with how the individual focuses and allocates attention. And again, these are things that you can't necessarily directly observe or that they can directly tell you about. Can they organize their thoughts, make plans, be able to understand connections between their behavior, other people's opinions, and so on? Another part of the cognitive domain is the mental flexibility and adaptability, or more precisely, the lack of flexibility and the unwillingness to compromise with others. And there are 5 symptoms to the cognitive domain. The first one is suspicious. These are individuals who are like distrustful and guarded. They won't necessarily want to open up too easily to other people. They're very hyper vigilant. Why are they like this? It's because they are constantly trying to screw other people over. So they're suspicious that other people are going to be doing the same to them. So for individuals with really high features of psychopathy, with the suspicious symptom in mind, it's difficult to get them to open up because when you tell them that things are going to be confidential, they might not necessarily believe you because they might have often told people like, oh yeah, I'll keep your secret, and then never do. Individuals scoring high on the cognitive domain lack concentration. So you'll ask them a question and they'll be looking out the window. They're very easily distractible and unfocused, not just in listening to what you are saying, but also in like keeping their own train of thought. Like they can just go off topic and I'll be like, I don't even know where I'm going with this answer. Like I completely forgot what I'm supposed to talk about. 2 similarly sounding symptoms are intolerance and inflexibility. Intolerance, however, is more about others and inflexibility is more about oneself. So intolerance is about attitudes towards others, being narrow-minded, being bigoted, hypercritical of other people, like constantly criticizing others for even small things. They won't really care about the opinions of these other people. Things like racism and sexism would be common amongst individuals with intolerant attitudes. Also anti-Semitism, or like, especially when we're looking at youth custody where most individuals are white, we can see examples of white supremacy. You can also have intolerant attitudes about specific institutions, like police, but also about like good kids. So like kids who are not engaging in crime are looked at sort of disparagingly. Inflexibility is about like the unwillingness to compromise, really set in stone. Their intolerance might be set in stone, but it can be other things like not willing to deviate from a course or a plan, disobeying direction from others, not listening to teachers, not following rules, wanting to do things their way. That lack of planfulness includes like individuals who are aimless, they're unsystematic, they're disorganized, don't really have like a specific goal in mind, or their goals are extremely unrealistic. They'll say things like they prefer to live day to day. So they can have like a goal but no plan to achieve that goal, or they just like to fly by the seat of their pants and sort of enjoy the spontaneity aspect of life. And here's a really offensive but clear example of how Justin was intolerant. So he said, "Teachers are condescending, so I don't like them. The education system sucks. Kids at school are arrogant and immature. These people seem to go out of their way to avoid truths and avoid bettering themselves through intelligence. I don't like people who are overly immature and judgmental," which again is kind of ironic since he just mentioned about how he didn't really like everybody and kind of judged everybody. "I don't respect people who are stupid, low functioning, or ignorant. Humankind is a giant parasite. I have no respect for people who do not pursue post-secondary education." If you'll remember, Justin had dropped out of school. He had not really, I think he was at like a grade 8, grade 9 education. So here, he's hypercritical of others, lacks introspection, is unwilling to change his opinion. Like, he says that he values education, but he's not willing to follow rules at school. He doesn't respect other people, doesn't care about teachers, but he also doesn't like people that are judgmental. Yet he's very quick to judge a lot of different people and make decisions like about those people. Like, I don't like school, so I'm just not going to go because other people there are stupid. To further illustrate Justin's intolerance, he said that, "I don't respect my mom because of her lack of motivation and effort. She is too emotional during arguments." And again, more derogatory language here, but he said, "Females are batshit crazy cheating sluts. They are there for sex and to clean up after me. Very early in life, I decided that everyone was an idiot." So on the one hand, like, I'm not necessarily certain that he does feel this way about women, but I think he wanted to be portrayed in a certain way, and he liked that feeling of how other people would see him as a womanizer. So this can be part intolerance and part related to identity. Others, like Albert, will focus their intolerance towards teachers, people in custody. They'll call other youth a rat if they are like pro-social individuals that aren't interested in engaging in criminal behavior. David was one kid who basically, I hate the law, I'm an outlaw, I'm not going to follow their rules. And he basically said that kids who talk to staff are soft, they're rats, they deserve to be punished, and they deserve to be beaten up. Talked a little bit about Justin's intolerance. Here's again a good example of his level of inflexibility. He's basically said that there's a problem with the school system, which is why I dropped out. The work is made for kids who don't know anything, so I'm not going to do it. I don't see the point of making a deal if I'm not going to benefit. So that was about his unwillingness to compromise. I'm very particular about grammar, so again, that's his inflexibility. I have arguments with friends over sentence structure, and I often get kicked out of chat rooms for commenting on people's grammar. So this speaks to his inflexibility, his unwillingness to compromise, but also like his controlling tendencies, which will be part of the dominance domain that we'll talk about in a moment. David was somebody who really showed a lack of planfulness in the traditional sense. So some individuals, they just have unrealistic goals. David didn't really think anything through. The offense that he was in custody for involved him bear macing a taxi driver because he got in the taxi without having any money, didn't even have his wallet. He did have bear mace though. He got to where he was going, said, I don't have any money, don't have my wallet, maced the taxi driver and ran away, and kind of bragged about it. He likes the fact that he doesn't think about consequences. This is something that's valued in his life. As I mentioned before, the individual who had superficial plans to go to treatment. So he said that he was going to go to treatment, but then talking with him, he showed like, no, he wants to actually go hang out with his girlfriend. He's still interested in using crack cocaine. So he didn't really have like a concrete plan to go to treatment, and he was very willing to deviate from that plan. Another reason for good follow-up questions is that youth will often say things like, oh yeah, I'm very organized. If you ask them how they're organized, it will be in very superficial ways. Like they would be like, I'm really organized because when I'm about to go commit crimes, I'll always make sure that I put my knife in my back left pocket, because if I'm running away from police, I'll always know to first reach into my back left pocket and throw my knife away. Also talk about like Albert would be like, oh yeah, I'm really organized because I'll lay out my clothes of what I'm gonna wear for the next day. So it's just really superficial things. They're not organized in the sense that they're thinking about life goals, thinking about week-to-week progress, making sure that they're completing homework assignments and things like that. So now on to the dominance domain, which speaks to like the degree of power or control that an individual attempts to exert over other people and exchanges with those people. So interpersonal behaviors are like the methods by which a person will engage others in order to meet their own needs. So they see other people basically as an opportunity to use that person to some sort of end. So we'll see frequent dominant exchanges between others. Rarely will we see submissive behavior or compliant behavior. So let's take a look at the symptoms of dominance. And there are 6 in total. Antagonistic describes individuals that are hostile towards other people. They're always disagreeable, or even more accurately, they like to needle at other people. Like it reminds me of like a little brother who will just constantly pester you and pester you and pester you to get attention. And it's a way of feeling like you're in control or you're dominating somebody else by being able to elicit a negative reaction. So that's what is key about antagonism. It's drawing that reaction and seeing that power you have to make other people feel a certain way. Domineering are individuals that are kind of loudmouth, arrogant, overbearing. They want to show a lot of control over situations and people. They'll try to sort of like enforce their rule or their will on or power over others. Individuals that are domineering will like force others to pay rent in the custody center. In a custody-centric cultural context, paying rent is like a tax that bigger, stronger, or more well-respected inmates will use or force others to pay. The bully will bully the other person into paying rent, and rent can be actually like financial payment or things like goods from the canteen or the cafeteria. Deceitfulness describes people that are dishonest, they're deceptive, they are two-faced, they'll work on misleading other people, cheating other people, or being like giving people a false impression. There's a big difference between being deceitful and being insincere. Insincerity is more like a specific type of deceitfulness, where it's more like a presentation of self as opposed to a presentation of like reality or history or what happened in the past. So people who are insincere will try to present themselves a certain ways. They can be very fake. They're good with coming up excuses. They'll admit to enjoying lying. Kids who are insincere will say things like, I'll ask them about a girlfriend. And if they say they have a girlfriend, I'll ask them about, okay, how do you get along with that girlfriend's parents? And they'll say like, oh, they think that I'm the nicest guy, I'm super polite to them, I'm very respectful, I use my like pleases and thank yous and so on. And I ask them, well, how come you're like that? And they'll say, well, I want to like be allowed to hang out with my girlfriend past her curfew and things like that. So if they think that I'm a nice guy, when I violate their rules, I'll like be more likely to get away with it. All people tend to have some tendency to engage in deceitfulness, but what separates individuals with psychopathy apart is the willingness to lie even when they're caught in that lie. And one of the reasons why they're willing to lie is because they really have no respect for the other person that they're lying to, or they think that they're so smart that they'll be able to lie their way out of things. So I'll give you like an example of deceitfulness. Like imagine like if you're a parent and you have like a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, And kids around that age are just learning like lying is a thing, and like lying can sometimes give you advantages and things. You're dad and you're trying to get your kid ready for school, but you're also trying to get ready for work. So you say like, I gotta go get dressed, get ready for work. While I'm gone, you need to eat your breakfast. You've got your banana and your yogurt and your granola there. And then when you're done, brush your teeth. You go to get dressed, and then you come back and you see a kid just sitting there in front of the TV, and you look on the kitchen island and there's a bag of Oreos and they're all over the place. So you go and say to the kid like, hey, I thought I said like eat your breakfast, did you brush your teeth? And he's like, oh yeah, I definitely ate my breakfast, I ate my banana and everything. And you look at the banana and it's still sitting there on the table unpeeled, and you say, no, your banana's right there. He's like, oh no, but I threw that banana away. I was finished with it and I threw it in the garbage. So you say, okay, I'll go check the garbage, see if that banana's still in there. Where's the peel? There's no peel in the garbage bag. What happened? Oh, I took the garbage out because I knew that you were like late for work and I wanted to be helpful. And so you say, well, what about these Oreos? Well, Dad, a bird came in and the bird opened up the Oreo package, but don't worry, I put the Oreos away. I didn't have any. And then I brushed my teeth. And you go into the bathroom and you look at the toothbrush and like the toothbrush is bone dry. You didn't brush your teeth. No, but like I wanted to wipe it down with a towel so I wouldn't make a mess in the bathroom. Like it's just like silly things they continue to lie about because they think like eventually I'll be able to talk my way out of it. So this is an example of like a 5-year-old. We will see sort of similar features for individuals with features of psychopathy. Individuals that are manipulative are trying to exploit others. They can be calculating, trying to figure out what can I gain, how do I have an advantage over this other person. So they're trying to control or influence other people, specifically for instrumental form of gain. So they can like feign empathy or feign like that they care about the other person. We've talked about before with the PCL, fake suicidal ideation is a way to get attention. So with manipulation, you really just feel like you're being exploited. Careless, on the other hand, is focusing on an individual's constant talking, wanting to be very pretentious, verbose words, trying to control the direction of the conversation, using words that are often even incorrect for the context, and they'll go off topic a lot. Dominance domain, obviously you're assessing for deceit, and so sometimes it's worthwhile to allow youth with strong features of psychopathy to continue to engage in certain types of deceit, because without challenging them, you kind of get a sense of how they want to portray themselves. Owen, for example, would repeatedly talk about his ability to manipulate sexual partners, how he was able to get girlfriends to pay for his food, to pay for his bus tickets. I really didn't get the sense that this was something that actually happened, because when I would ask him about like what sorts of things would you get your girlfriends to do for you, he came up with like odd examples like paying for bus tickets, which it seems like a weird thing that you would get other people to pay for. And I think it was just something that came off the top of his head. It wasn't actually a real example, but it gives you a sense of the personality that he's trying to portray. Jacob would talk about making thousands of dollars a day, selling drugs, renting limos, partying in strip clubs, and he was like 14 years old. Very clear that he was not actually doing these types of things. He'd talk about how he had a female friend. He tried to say that his relationship with this female friend, like a platonic relationship, and he wanted to protect this female friend. He would describe how he would put on a bulletproof vest and go to his friend's house and sit at her kitchen table waiting for her boyfriend to show up, and you would put a gun on the table with it pointing in the direction of where the boyfriend would walk in, and you would use that as a way to intimidate the boyfriend into treating his friend the right way. And again, something that I didn't really believe. It seemed like an unbelievable story, but maybe something that he really wanted others to think or see him as this type of tough guy that cared about the well-being of women, which definitely was not the case, because he would show real clear examples of negative attitudes towards women. His father was a white supremacist. He had these ideas as well. When I did the interview with Jacob, we were doing 2 interviewers at a time. So it was me and a colleague of mine who's a woman. And she was actually not just my colleague, she was basically my boss at the time. We were doing some training. She was the one doing the interview. So like we'd have like a lead interviewer, and then like I would come up with follow-up questions or things to add after my colleague was done. And she would ask the individual the question, and then he would, instead of answering her, he would look at me and answer the question to me, basically showing that he didn't have respect for her. Imagine that you are me, and then my colleague Lauren is just off the screen here. I'm the kid being interviewed, Lauren's talking to me, and then I would answer and I would look right into the camera, or look right at you instead of looking at Lauren and answering her. I don't think that he actually had this sort of desire to see his girls that were friends protected. Owen was extremely antagonistic, so when describing this conflict with others, he said that when my mom criticizes me, I just call her fat. I'm not going to cry about it. Most people think that I'm an asshole, and kind of like endorse and like that image. I like to bully in a roundabout way, is what he said. I like to push people's buttons to try and get them to react, get them angry. So like, this made my job so easy to assess antagonism, because he's just basically describing word for word exactly what it is that I'm looking for. Another symptom again is that garrulousness, and Owen would talk about how he preferred to interact with people over the internet rather than in person, because he had time to think of, in his words, extravagant words, and enjoyed the idea of having to explain to others the meaning of a word. He didn't have like a really expansive vocabulary, but he liked talking over chat rooms or internet forums because he could like look up words that he wanted to use, and then that was his way of having control over other people that wouldn't necessarily understand the word, and then he could explain the word and then kind of talk down to them. But I think like my favorite example of antagonism during an interview was when I was talking to Justin, and he dropped some reference to Mark Twain, and then he was waiting to do this. This was all part of like a little act. It wasn't some like natural part of the conversation. He dropped this Mark Twain reference, and then like if my hat is my hand during the interview, he like reached across the table and almost put his hand over top of my hand and looked me in the eye with like this very patronizing tone. He's like, "I'm sorry, that's probably too esoteric a reference for you to understand." So patronizing, so condescending, so like phony sympathy. Really, he just enjoyed the idea of showing me that I know that you're doing your PhD or whatever, but I know about Mark Twain. You didn't ask me anything about Mark Twain, but because I know about Mark Twain, it's going to allow me to have that power over you. He would talk about like Cartesian mapping, like cartography, and like how the Mayans developed. Like, he would just pick random topics that are relatively obscure and like to bring them up in conversation to feel like he was on the inside, like he knew something that I definitely did not know. And later in the interview, Justin basically like acknowledged that he liked to be manipulative. So he said, "I like to be condescending as a way of being manipulative. I am underhanded and calculating." And again, we don't show them the symptoms of the CAP. We don't tell them like we're rating you for psychopathy. We talk about how we want to look at their personality. I really should have said this at the beginning. Here's something that's really important to understand about our interview. When we are assessing for psychopathy, we don't tell the youth, "Hey, we're going to assess you for psychopathy. We want to see if you're a psychopath or not, or we want to look at your level of remorse, your level of guilt, are you callous and unemotional, and so on." We just frame it as we want to get a sense of your personality. So we don't actually say like we're asking these questions because we want to look at whether or not you're grandiose, or we're looking at your sense of uniqueness. We just ask the questions to say that we're trying to get a better sense of who you are. So Justin was basically almost repeating word for word the specific symptoms of psychopathy that we were looking for. And the CAP isn't something that was very well known at the time. So it's not as if I felt that he had done some research and knew that I was assessing for psychopathy and knew that I was using the CAP. I think that when he said things like, "I can manipulate things in situations," he was just being very honest about who he thinks he is as a person. Cleckley talked about the mask of sanity, and people like Ramirez and Kemper have talked about like trying on different personalities. Kemper would go into the cop bar and he would try on being a police officer. This is something that Justin actually acknowledged as well. He said, like, I'm able to be whoever I want to project. Like the arrogant, condescending know-it-all. I can mold my personality to get different reactions. I like testing the waters before I reveal who I really am. So he likes to get a sense of who other people are, what he can get away with. I'll act calm and knowledgeable. I'll show the rest of me later on, is what he said. So this is an example of insincerity, faking or pretending to be a certain type of person to first judge the other person. Like you've heard, like in hockey, there's a phrase like, make the player make the first move if you're playing defense. For Justin, it's kind of the same thing. He's trying to be almost neutral, not allow people to understand who he really is until he sees who they are, and then he can kind of get a sense of how to manipulate them and how to control them. When I was talking about that lying example of the youth or the child and the Oreos, it was because it reminded me so much of my interview with Albert, who had committed a sexual offense, a really serious sexual offense against a very elderly woman who was the mother of his mother's boyfriend. She was about like 70 years old, and he committed this really horrific assault, and he lied consistently about his involvement in this offense. When I asked him about what the offense was for bringing him into custody, he claimed that he had committed a homicide offense. Then I asked him for details of the homicide offense, and he described to me about how he had a brother that was beaten up very badly by this other guy, and he saw this guy in like the front window of a pizza store or something like that, and he went into his car and grabbed a baseball bat and beat this other guy to death. And it was a very detailed story, but the reason why he was able to be so detailed and descriptive, it was not because he was very creative. It's because he'd actually stolen the details of the offense from another youth that was living on his unit. He didn't know that I'd already interviewed that kid before. I knew about this story. I talked about it to the other kid about this offense. And so I knew that he was lying. So I mentioned to him right then and there, because I was getting the sense that he would just continue to be very dishonest. So to remind you, we do have access to your file, and we do know that you were involved in a sexual offense, and I wanted to ask about the offense that you were here for to get a sense of things from your perspective. Is it true that you were involved in a sexual offense? And he denied it. So I went on with the interview for a little bit more, and then decided to challenge him again. So about that sexual offense, what is actually going on there? Because there is that discrepancy between what you're saying and what's going on in your file. And then he was like, oh no, yeah, don't worry. It's a clerical error. He literally said that to me. It's a clerical error. It's on my file, but it's actually wrong. And my lawyers are going to court to get this fixed for me. And don't worry, I'll get them to send you the paperwork when it's all finished. None of this was actually happening. There was no clerical error, but he just was wanting to continue on with the lie. And now on to the emotional domain. And there are 5 symptoms of this domain that we need to assess. A lack of anxiety, which characterizes individuals that are unconcerned, unworried, they're basically fearless. That Kemper interview is a great example of someone who seems to have a real lack of anxiety, even when he's been caught for an offense, even when he knows that he's going to jail, doesn't seem to be too worried or uneasy. And one of the reasons for this could be related to that underactive behavioral activation systems, like that fight or flight system doesn't really kick in for this individual. Does not worry about things like school tests. When they're lying, they are able to not be worried about getting caught in the lie because they really lack anxiety. Lacks pleasure is where individuals are really pessimistic, gloomy. They don't really have anything that they say that they're looking forward to. They're very unenthusiastic. So when I'm talking to individuals about the future, they don't really seem excited for the future, even if they're about to be released from custody. They don't really respond to praise very well. So if you say things to them you're doing great during the interview, we really appreciate it, there's no reaction. They don't really have much emotion or happiness. Or they can have happiness, but it's really, as I mentioned, happiness that is not infectious. They'll laugh at the misfortune of others. Here's where students can get really confused. On the one hand, one feature of psychopathy is a lack of emotional depth. On the other hand, another feature is a lack of emotional stability. If you are unstable in your emotions, doesn't that mean that at least you experience emotions? So here's how the two can coexist. A lack of emotional stability is really moving up and down in a very superficial way. So these high and low emotions are very superficial. There's not a lot of depth to them. So they can be indifferent, basically overall inexpressive, but at times they can also switch off or switch on and become very angry or irritated. So if they lack emotional depth, they'll generally be indifferent, not caring about things, not experiencing strong feelings of emotion. But that doesn't mean they will never have any emotion. They will switch on and off quite quickly, so they can be very temperamental and moody. They will lack consistency of emotion, so they can move up and down without much warning. File can indicate that they'll use a language like fly off the handle, or they'll have temper tantrums quite easily. They can be very easily annoyed and irritated. These are examples of a lack of emotional stability. Whereas a lack of emotional depth is when they have very monotone speech, they have difficulty describing their emotions, so they might say that they feel emotions, but they don't actually have the ability to describe how those emotions feel to them. Lack of remorse, very straightforward. They just tend to be unapologetic for their behavior. They don't feel bad for behavior that's harmed others. They don't really have that sense of guilt or shame. They might apologize. They'll apologize only to get out of trouble or to avoid being seen as a bad person. For example, in court, they might apologize because they think that it will result in a reduced sentence. But if you probe further, you can get the sense that they only feel bad because they got caught, or they only apologize because they wanted to get out of trouble. Owen's lack of remorse was quite clear when talking about his offense. He basically said, I haven't done a lot that requires me to be sorry for. Even though he can't actually say the offense that he committed because it was so specific that it can reveal their identities, but it was a really horrific offense. He suggested that he regrets the offense, but then when probed further, he basically said, I don't know, I largely regret it for myself. So he felt bad that he got caught and he was being put in custody. And then he said he felt bad for his family, but really the reason why he felt bad for his family was because of how they saw him. He basically said this offense sucks because the last thing I need to be is to be depicted as a bad person. So he was feeling bad about the offense, not for the harm that caused the family and caused the victim, but the harm that was brought to him by the public knowing about his crime, about how the justice system had responded to him. And I would say that this is fairly common for individuals with strong features of psychopathy. They almost always will indicate that they regret the offense, but usually it's because they regret the offense because of the circumstances that it has placed them in. They don't really feel bad about the victim. David, for example, noted that he regretted his assault on that taxi driver, but when asked which aspect of the crime he regretted, he said that it was because he got charged with it. It wasn't something I wanted to happen, but it had to happen. So again, kind of pulling away the blame, not thinking about how the taxi driver might have been injured, might have had to take time off of work. These weren't really considerations that David had. When we think about emotions, we think about empathy. And there are two types of empathy, emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. And Justin definitely had cognitive empathy. He understood that this was an emotion that people were supposed to feel. He just didn't really feel it himself. So he lacked the emotional aspect of empathy. And so it appeared like he really could only understand emotion in an objective sense. He said that I could have felt remorse for the victim, but doing so would accomplish nothing because the action had already been carried out. Expressions of remorse would be patronizing. And I think he was right about that. It would be patronizing because he doesn't actually feel remorse. He knew that it was something he was supposed to say, but he wasn't interested in actually saying it. I think this demonstrates that Justin could not really feel remorse, but he knew when remorse was appropriate. He just didn't really care to show it. Remember that Jacob was the individual that was pointing the gun to, or claimed that he was pointing a gun towards his friend's boyfriend to kind of intimidate him into treating his friend well. He would be the type of person that would not really have that infectious pleasure. his pleasure seemed to come at the expense of others. For example, he said that he did have pleasure, but then he's told us that we couldn't really experience pleasure. You didn't have a sense of what it's like to be like powerful like him. And he said that he really had a sense of control. He said, you haven't felt empowered until you've held a gun to someone's head. So this is a great example of something that would definitely not be infectious pleasure. He's enjoying it, but obviously it's not going to bring joy to the victim in this case. Another good example of how individuals will lack pleasure is when it comes to playing sports. Albert, for example, initially said he liked sports because he liked to win. Albert explained that the reason why he liked playing sports was because it gave him an opportunity to antagonize others. He liked to develop different lines that he could use. Like during volleyball, he would say things to people like "losers serve," and you kind of just needle them. He said he enjoys doing things to piss people off. He would even not play a particular sport if he thought he could lose because he wouldn't want that individual to have that sense of power over him. Or he would make sure that he always had an excuse in case he did in fact lose. So it didn't seem like Albert actually enjoyed sports. Rather, it was more like sports gave him an opportunity to have a feeling of control over others or to antagonize others. The sixth and final domain of the CAP is the self domain, which has 7 symptoms that focus on how an individual sees themselves. Basically, do they want to be self-centered, self-aggrandizing? How do they want other people to see them? Do they think that they're deserving of special privileges, and so on? So it's about the awareness the person has of their own identity. Sometimes they don't necessarily have a very good awareness of their identity. Having awareness of identity kind of also requires having awareness of how other people see you. And for individuals that lack emotional depth or are often not thinking about things like empathy, putting themselves in the position of others, they might not see or even care about how others see them. They just might want the attention, want to be known as great, but ultimately when it comes to particular individuals, they don't really care about them. We'll take a look now at each of these 7 symptoms. Self-centeredness and self-aggrandizing sound a little bit similar, but the key difference is that self-centeredness is where you want all of the attention to be about me. So you want everybody, you, everybody focus on me. The attention has to be on me. Self-aggrandizing is more about letting people know how great you are. So it's self-promoting, being patronizing towards others, making sure everybody knows how great you are and how great you believe that you are. Self-aggrandizing is about how important you think you are, being conceited or condescending towards other people, whereas self-centeredness is concerned only with yourself, not worrying about how other people think or feel, just wanting the conversation to always be about you. That's why it can be a little bit easier to interview kids with features of psychopathy, because they want to talk about themselves. In a natural conversation, there would be a back and forth. I ask you questions, you ask me questions. For people that are self-centered, they want it to be 100% on them. When it comes to a sense of uniqueness, it's not just about being good. It's more about being extraordinary, or again, extraordinary. Having skills, abilities, qualities that nobody else has, so they feel that they're really different from other people. Feel like their treatment could help others, but not themselves. They're unique. That cognitive behavioral therapy program, that might work for everybody else, but all the kids in Custody Center here, they're really stupid. I'm different. I'm unique. I have a different background. It doesn't even have to be positive qualities. It can just be that nobody could really begin to understand them. Individuals with a high sense of self will be self-entitled, so they'll believe that they are deserving of special qualities or privileges. They should be allowed to break certain rules, or those rules shouldn't apply to them because of their specific kind of sense of entitlement. Sense of invulnerability basically means that this individual thinks that they can do things without any sort of backlash or punishment. They can be risk-taking and they'll be able to accomplish just about everything. So they have a sense that they don't have to necessarily work hard. Things will just work out for them, that they don't have any weaknesses. They only have strengths. They've never really experienced failure. They'll actually say, I don't really have any failures to talk about or weaknesses to talk about. Self-justifying is about individuals that will minimize or deny or blame others for their involvement in certain behaviors. So in minimizing behavior, they might say like, oh, well, like the victim wasn't really hurt to begin with. They deny it, it's basically like lying, or blaming would be like, well, the victim precipitated. They did something and they got what was coming to them. For these individuals, they have a belief that they are sort of free from blame, that their actions were right or justified in some way, so they're not really responsible for their behaviors. They might blame the victim or minimize their drug use. Unstable self-concept is where they won't have a very clear identity of who they actually are. So their attitudes about themselves, who they are, constantly kind of changing. So they have difficulty describing who they actually are and how they might differ from others. Justin recognized that he kind of had a self-aggrandizing personality. I didn't ask him questions about what his body looked like, but he would just randomly talk about how good of a body he had, and that he liked to just look at himself in the mirror, and he commented that he felt most natural when he was an arrogant and condescending know-it-all. So remember when I talked about his, like, he would try on different personalities? He kind of acknowledged that, and that could actually be a really good example of the incomplete sense of self that he might have, where he's trying on these different personality characteristics, but also understanding that he felt most comfortable when he was arrogant and condescending. Even though he had dropped out of school and had been in an alternate school and dropped out of that school, he said, I need to be put on a standard of real schoolwork because I know that I'm good. When I complete the work, it's great. And teachers in his file, he even commented that he had like a very, like this is their actual quote, an arrogant and superior attitude. And I think that this is particularly damning because it's like if the teachers are saying this about him, it's probably true. And he had even been expelled from school because of his behaviors and attitudes towards teachers. He talked at length about his superior ability to win intellectual games or arguments. And his grandmother, like if your grandmother is saying bad things about you, you're probably a relatively bad person. And his grandmother even mentioned his superior attitude. Again, focusing on Justin, maybe like one of the best quotes that I've heard in an interview, other than maybe the time that he told me that that reference was too esoteric for me, was where he said that, in quotes, my friends are merely a fragment of myself, like a Venn diagram with me in the center, where he really felt like his friends don't really measure up to him. He's so unique from his friends. His friends will try and be like him, but nobody can really be like him. And he would even talk about how his friends would try to emulate his behavior and his mannerisms, but they would just try, and nobody could actually accomplish being who he was because he was too unique. Owen was very blunt when it came to describing his sense of entitlement. And so often kids can be having a sense of entitlement in custody and wanting special privileges, but mostly it's because they're like bored out of their mind and they just want to break rules, or they want to be able to leave the room more often or go do things outside of the custody center and so on. So Owen said, hell yeah, I deserve to be treated differently. I deserve to be treated differently because of my abilities. I'm on a different intellectual level than most people. People might not understand me unless they can look up the words that I use. And remember, that goes back to his behavior on internet forums where he would basically look up words himself and then show them or use them in sentences with other people to try and get them confused. As mentioned previously, Owen had broken up with his girlfriend, and it's because he felt entitled to basically sleep around with other people because he was going to go to custody and deserve that break. Albert was kind of similar to Justin. He wasn't able to articulate his sense of self with that Venn diagram, but he did talk about how his peers always looked up to him and tried to mimic his personality. And when I asked for examples, he'd say things like, oh yeah, they would always try to copy how I sit, but they could never really copy how I sit. And again, it's that example of like really like sense of uniqueness, but combined with like lying, where I asked him to give examples of how peers would try to mimic his personality, and he gives me this really odd one of like his peers copying how he sits. And I think that's, again, like we see that intersection of different symptoms at once. With Albert, it was a tendency to want to be seen as unique, very self-aggrandizing, but also very deceitful. And Albert would even say like, oh, it really bothers me that people try to copy my style, but I don't have to worry about it too much because ultimately they're all unsuccessful. So it kind of bringing in like this sense of a uniqueness with like sense of self-aggrandizing where, yeah, people could try to copy me because I'm very unique, but I'm too good to be copied. Justin's sense of self was wrapped up as well in other people, and here's where assessing psychopathy can become quite difficult, because it's easy to confuse when an individual cares about other people truly versus when an individual uses others as a way to help shape their identity. And the reason why individuals with features of psychopathy might use others on top of that manipulative purpose, they might need other people to help shape their identity, because as I mentioned, one of the symptoms is like that incomplete sense of self. So they might use others to sort of form who they are. We could really see this as well if you ever watched interviews with Richard Kuklinski. He basically would constantly talk about how much he cared for his family. But I think that he was also quite abusive towards his family. And I think he used his family as a way to shape his identity as a family man. Like, he liked that sense of being a man's man, hosting the barbecues. It wasn't because he cared about other people. He liked that was a way for other people to view him. It was a way to create kind of, again, one of those masks that people will see that can confuse or trick them into thinking that he's actually a good family man. Justin, for example, described to me about how he really cared about his girlfriend, and gave one example of an incident where she almost got hit by a car and he was really worried about her and what would have happened to her. He only worried about her because of what that might mean for their relationship. Justin saw his girlfriend like a trophy. Justin saw his girlfriend the way you might see your car. If you've got your car parked in the parking lot of a mall and then you go shopping and you come back and you see somebody scratched up your car, you might feel bad, you might be upset, but you're not upset for the car. You're upset for yourself. You really like that car, and maybe like you're a car enthusiast, so it's part of your identity. You don't actually care about the car, and that's okay because the car's not a person. It doesn't have feelings or emotion. But for Justin, he's treating his girlfriend like a car. He cared about his girlfriend getting hurt, not because of what would happen to her, but would that change how she looked? And would that change how people saw him and his type of identity? These individuals see their relationships as trophies. They help reflect to other people who they are. They make them feel more unique, better about themselves, because it helps establish their identity. Thanks for sticking with me through these 2 weeks of psychopathy. Again, it's a topic that I'm really passionate about, have a lot to say about this. So if you have any questions from today's lecture, please reach out to me. I'll make sure that I pay attention to tutorial discussions. Usually when I do this in person, we can have a lot of back and forth about the symptoms that I'm seeing, help students understand why they're different. So please, if you have any questions, definitely reach out and let me know. Take care, everyone.